So today we're going to experience two firsts. The first is that I'm going to be basing a talk around a simple koan. I've never done a talk around a simple koan before. And the second first is that I'm going to be proposing a new precept for our collection of precepts. So this is going to be very exciting. So the koan that I'm starting with today, again, it's one of the simple koans, and it simply says, how do you stop the fighting across the river? How do you stop the fighting across the river? Now, this has gone through several versions because originally when Steph and Margaret were teaching in the Hudson Valley in Kerhonkson, New York, the koan said, how do you stop the fighting across the Hudson River? And then when they moved up to Orono, it was, how do you stop the fighting across the Penobscot River? And now, technically, since Treetop is in Oakland, it probably should say, how do you stop the fighting across the Kennebec River? But I don't think any of those substantially changes the answer. Maybe. The Hudson, that's wider than the Kennebec, isn't it? But you know, this koan, let's talk about simple koans first. For those of you who aren't doing koan study, you may say, well, what are these simple koans? What does that mean? And the simple koans were elements extracted from some of the more complex traditional koans. And they're simple in the sense that they focus on one point and only one point. Okay. Whereas other koans can be subject to really multiple ways of understanding them, and they may be making several points simultaneously. The simple koans are making one point only. So the fact that they are called simple koans does not necessarily mean that they are easy koans. They simply are not complex in their structure. And they're looking for, they have this very one-pointed, and that in some ways can make them more difficult because you can't sort of get by with getting close. You've got to kind of hit the nail right on the head with these koans. Now, the wonderful part about them, and you know, again, those of you that are doing koan study know this and others don't, is that in our lineage, we use them in a preparatory way to help people get a feel for koans and koan study before they embark on the more complex koans. Initially in the Muman Khan, the Gateless Gate is the first collection of the full koans. But these help people prepare. And I've told this story before. You know, the traditional way you did koan study, or any Zen practice for that matter, certainly in Rinzai Zen, was you went in the Daisan the first time with the teacher, and the teacher gave you the Mu koan. You know, does a dog have Buddha nature? Mu. And then you struggled with that koan for some period of time, or you quit. And I believe that probably more often than not, the latter happened. That can be, to really truly penetrate that koan is not easy at all. And I think I've told you that I mean, I was introduced to koan study that more traditional way And I spent 6 years wrestling around with that mu koan. Didn't pass it. And didn't pass it until I came to work with Stefan Mar. Most people don't take 6 years. That's probably the fact that I'm sort of a dunce at koans. But when I came to Stefan Margaret, they backed me up. They said, okay, we're going to try on these simple koans first. And then after I worked on the simple koans for a while, they said, okay, we think you're ready to go on and start doing some of the koans in the Mumonkan. And after I had done those for a while, they said, okay, at the next retreat, you're going to do mu. And by then I knew, might not be the right word, knowing might not be the right word, but I had the feeling for how to work with koans. I had experienced koans. I had passed some koans. And when I came up against mu, the reason they said in the next retreat, because their contention that I agree with 100%, is it's almost impossible to develop the concentration you need to pass mu while living your ordinary life with all the distractions and all the things going on. You really need to have the focus of a retreat, preferably a week-long retreat, to break past that particular barrier. And it's a very important step in our Zen practice. But anyway, so Stefan Margaret kind of took me back. I did those. So when I got to mu, I was prepared. And that's, to me, is so skillful, as opposed to just kind of throwing people into the bog and saying, if you come out, great. And if you don't, well, you weren't meant to be a Zen student. It's not like we have a surplus of Zen students these days that we want to chase many of them away. On the contrary. Nor do we have a surplus of kind and compassionate human beings. So I think that, so that's the other thing. I think, that was the entire crux of whether you got to study with a teacher or not, was whether you worked on mu and past mu, so on and so forth. How many over the years, not hundreds, but thousands or tens of thousands of wonderful, sincere people were driven away from Zen because they didn't pass that koan in some reasonable period of time. And if we're, it goes to that shift. I've talked about it before. The shift that I see is, are we looking to develop people who manifest compassion and loving kindness? Or are we looking to produce wonderful enlightenments? Sometimes those are the same, but not always, right? And I'd rather see those wonderful, compassionate people manifesting loving kindness. Frankly, there are assholes who are greatly enlightened. It's truly, enlightenment is an opportunity to be a much better human being, but not everybody takes full advantage of that. So anyway, I don't want to get off on that. So the koan, back to the koan.
Peter, you're muted.
Huh. I don't know how I got muted. My computer is telling me to shut up.
That's a really tricky koan.
So what was the last thing that you heard?
On to the koan.
You heard the koan? Didn't hear the koan.
He said on to the koan.
On to the koan, stopping the fighting across the river. Well, so this falls into a class of what we call one body koans. It is pointing to the nature of reality as one body. It is pointing to what we sometimes refer to as non-separation. And the answer, I'm not giving anything away here. Anybody who's working on the simple koans, when they come to this, will have to present an answer that's much better than mine. But the answer here is that the way we intervene with the fighting across the river is by cultivating peace in our own hearts and in our own minds. That goes to the concept of the one body. If we understand that everything in this universe is intimately connected in a way that it's impossible to understand intellectually, frankly. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh and others have created an intellectual way of seeing this, you know, and you can talk about, you know, I don't know, a plate of cereal, and you can go back and say, okay, that cereal came on a truck and it was harvested and planted by a farmer, and it got rain and it got sun and it got soil. And, you know, we can kind of construct this way, an intellectual way of seeing how in fact, the entire universe is involved in creating your bowl of cereal in the morning. But this is something different in the sense that it is really seeing deeply into intimacy, into interconnectedness, into non-separation. And so when any piece of the universe changes, the entire universe changes. In the same way that what happens to your big toe happens to all of you. You may not pay a lot of attention to your big toe until you stub it. And by golly, all of you knows it. All of you feels the pain, right? It's a reminder. That's a very simple example, but that when we're talking about one body, we're talking about that deep a level. Everything affects everything else. And this is so important. And yet intellectually, it's hard to understand, and maybe hard, you know, hard to believe even. That my life, what I do, as insignificant as it is, can infect, infect also, but affect the entire universe. That everything is somehow transformed by my life, when on a cosmic scale, I am not even a grain of sand. Hard to wrap ourselves around, but that's the truth. And that's what realization or enlightenment shows us. That's what that experience is all about. Experiencing the one body, the truth of the one body. Seeing deeply into it, not as an intellectual construct, not as a thought, but here it is, right in front of our eyes. It is true. And it is an essential truth. And it has such serious implications because it means that all of our lives really and truly matter. No matter who we are, no matter where we are, no matter how insignificant we may be in terms of human hierarchies and structures. We really matter. Our lives really matter. What we think and do really matters. And that's how, in terms of this koan, that's how we stop the fighting across the river. By finding the way to peace in our own heart, in our own mind. Now that change that we create, in all likelihood, is not discernible or not measurable. But when enough people make that change, make that commitment, something happens. The world is transformed. And I don't want to get off. I mean, there's also other, there's nonlinear things that go on also that can mean that it isn't always a one-for-one correspondence. That someone, who knows what reverberations the change in anyone's heart and life can have. So why am I bringing up this koan today? Yesterday, Elizabeth and I went for a drive, kind of a spring drive in mud season, but we pretended. We went through some of the coast. Anyway, and a number of the churches that we passed had Ukrainian flags and signs indicating their support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. It's really interesting, right? I mean, something about this conflict in Ukraine, and I don't necessarily want to get into too much speculation on that, has somehow triggered the imagination of the American people, right? Russians killed people in Syria. You didn't pass churches with signs saying support the Syrian people and Syrian flags. They did in Chechnya. They did in, Azerbaijan, lots of places. Why are we suddenly upset about Ukraine? And we could get off into the geopolitics of that, which are really not my intention. But for those of us who are concerned about the Dharma and the precepts, I think it raises an interesting challenge. And I'm not asking for a show on hands of this, but how many people may have cheered when they've seen the images of the Russian tanks being blown up or Russian MiGs shot out of the sky? And yet those are human beings being killed. Those are human beings dying. It is a war. It has all of the brutality of any war. And so I find, I'm going to speak for myself with this, it challenges me. We have this precept of loving kindness and nonviolence. And yet I'm kind of rooting for the Ukrainian people. And when I'm rooting for them, I'm kind of by default rooting for Russians to be killed. How many times have I had the thought, I'm going to take total blame? I have to fight with myself on this. Oh God, I wish somebody would just take Putin out. Just get rid of that guy. And yet I'm wishing for the death or the destruction of another human being. So there's a couple of possibilities here. I think this whole situation in Ukraine really challenges us. You know, and then again, then there's there's all the sort of peripheral, I mean, they're not peripheral, but other issues around, you know, again, why there, why now? Not why aren't we upset when Saudis are killing Yemenis? You know, why aren't we upset when Russians are killing Syrians? And there's lots of answers, and the geopolitics of those situations. You know, this one sort of seems black and white in terms of today's world. There's no sort of terrorist groups and confusion. No, it's all like this is innocent. Ukrainians did nothing. Bam, they get attacked. Very clear kind of thing. So in some ways, it's less morally ambiguous than a lot of the. And furthermore, I think few people have the illusion that Putin intends to stop at the borders of Ukraine. This really is a 1939 in Poland moment. And if the world doesn't make a clear position and stand, this may evolve into something even worse than it already is. All of that complexity. But I think at least for me, again, it challenges me around the precept. Do I really mean loving kindness and nonviolence? And if I do, how do I take that stand here? And I think there are ways, by the way. I think there are skillful ways. I think, to be really careful to support the Ukrainian people and the safety of the Ukrainian people, but not be wishing the death of the Russian soldiers, or and you look at them. If you looked at the pictures of the Russian soldiers, they're a bunch of kids. They're a bunch of 17-year-olds who got conscripted. Somebody shoved a gun in their hand and put them on the bus to Ukraine. And that's who's being killed over there. I mean, Ukrainians too, but of the Russians. It's not Putin. It's not oligarchs. Same in every war, right? That's every war. It's not the old men who are out there, the old men that create the wars. It's a bunch of poor young kids. Probably when I say poor because in the war, but also probably poor because they are economically poor. We don't send the upper middle class off to war. We don't send the upper class off to war. They get to have bone spurs. In this country, overwhelmingly young people of color getting sent off to. That's certainly what happened in Vietnam, and in all the wars since. So where do we plant? Where do we, if we are taking Zen seriously, if we're taking the precepts seriously, where do we plant our feet in all of this? And all of this ambiguity and chaos and horror and pain. I'm not going to answer that question because I don't have the answer to that question. But I'm going to point us back to the precept. I vow the precept that we have in our treetop lineage. It's something that Steph added. I vowed to take up the way of loving kindness and nonviolence. This is a very, very, I have taken this precept several times because each time you go through a passage, you go through Jukai, you go through Denkai, you go through Dembo, you're taking the various ceremonies as you progress as a as a Zen priest, you take the precepts each time. You reaffirm that they are the guideposts for your life. And it's only recently that I've really kind of started to wrestle with the implication of this one of loving kindness and nonviolence. Loving kindness, that's a slam dunk, right? It's really easy. I'm going to have loving kindness for Vladimir Putin. Not so easy. But that's not the hard part. The nonviolence is the hard part. Do we really mean nonviolence? Should the Ukrainians be putting down their guns and lying under the Russian tanks? If we encounter somebody being attacked and beaten, do we fail to intervene because to intervene would mean we need to use violence? It sounds really good. It sounded good to me. You know, nonviolence. Of course I'm nonviolent. It's really easy to be nonviolent when we aren't surrounded by violence. So I'm very ambivalent about this precept, as I am ambivalent about Ukraine, as I am ambivalent about all war and violence and how we respond. You know, Gandhi believed that we could respond to Hitler with nonviolence. Early in the war. Which to me is just absolutely inconceivable. You couldn't pile up enough dead bodies to shame a sociopath like Hitler. And I think, as I understand, I read this, I'm not positive, that Gandhi realized his mistake after a while, that he changed his position. You know, he understood that there was something there that, you know, was so profoundly sociopathic that it would not respond. You know, the nonviolence as a tactic, whether it was in India, whether it was in the American South, was dependent on shaming the oppressors, right? The British only responded in India when the world press came in and started showing the images of the British soldiers beating the Indian people. And in the American South, the same thing. The country and the world only responded when the images of National Guardsmen and sheriffs and all these people beating the demonstrators, the civil rights demonstrators. Right, that was the basis of nonviolence as a tactic, is to bring out and to actually provoke and the oppressors and shame them with their violence. Only works when there's an audience. Only works when that audience gets upset enough. So not simple issues, not simple issues. How do we respond? How do we respond? Because if we understand this idea of one body, we have no choice but to respond. There are no sidelines. We can't say, well, that's way over there in Europe. We too are intimately involved in Ukraine. We are intimately involved in Yemen. We are intimately involved in Israel and Palestine. I could go on, you know, there are no sidelines. When we understand the one body, we understand there's no safe haven. We are involved whether we want to be or not. We can ignore it, but that's a sense, that's a response. So now I want to come to I mentioned a new precept. I want to extend this now, this idea that there are no sidelines in the world. There've never been. But today it's more apparent than ever. We are all involved, whether we want to be or not. And so just as this is true with war and violence against other humans, it is also true with violence against the natural world. It is also true with the ecological devastation that we are currently visiting upon all of our natural relations. And so the new precept that I'd like to propose, and this will be up for discussion, debate, rebuttal, whatever, is I vow to take up the way of simplicity and eco-intimacy. That term eco-intimacy was, as far as I know, was coined by my friend Aaron Scharf. But it makes so much sense to me because, again, this goes to the one body. That which we are intimate with, we cannot harm. If we really understand that the trees and the plants and the animals and the waters are our body, we will naturally take care of them just like we will take care of our own physical body. Right? It's only through separation. That's over there, not my responsibility. Doesn't matter, doesn't affect me. When we create separation, we can either actively destroy or allow destruction. So this is a reminder. No, it's not separate. Eco-intimacy and simplicity, just simplicity in our lives. It doesn't say all of us have to, I don't know what, move out of our homes and live in tiny houses, eating only granola. But it encourages us to simplify. And for every one of us, just like all the precepts, there's no set meaning to that. That's going to mean something different for each one of us in each moment. But it's an encouragement. Encouragement to stop and reflect and think, do I need that next whatever it is? And the answer might be yes. But at least we're pausing, we're asking the question. On the eco side, we tend to blame the producers, right? The big industries, big pharma, big agriculture. And yet we as consumers are just as culpable. If we don't buy it, they're going to stop making it. And we go, we have no power. We can't do anything. Those corporations are so big. They're so big because we keep feeding them. We keep feeding them with our money. If suddenly everybody in the world stopped buying Monsanto products, Monsanto would go out of business. I hope that nobody here today, I don't like to be judgmental, but I'm going to be, is buying glyphosate Roundup, one of Monsanto's most popular products. That's also among their most destructive. But there's a good chance if you live in a neighborhood with lawns, you have neighbors who buy it and use it to exterminate weeds when it is highly carcinogenic, and they're finding out they're tying it to leukemias and other things, and yet Monsanto keeps freely selling it, and people keep freely, agricultural crops is the biggest and worst application, but people are putting it on lawns, and right. So what happens? Is Monsanto to blame for that? Or are the people putting it on their lawns also responsible? The farmers putting it on their fields also responsible? So that's why I'm suggesting this precept, to remind us that we are all responsible. We can't put the blame somewhere else. We need to clean our own houses and take responsibility.
Peter, one question I have about all this is, so if we are extremely intimate with everything that's going on and fighting in the Ukraine and the poisoning of the lawns and all that, it seems like we could spend our entire lives every instant doing nothing but trying to fix it, whereas, you look at the Dalai Lama, who, is an exemplar of compassion and loving kindness and awareness. And so much of the time he is joyful and laughing. And there's something about that that is kind of challenging to wrap my head around.
Okay, it's a very good question, very good observation. And my answer is this. A clear mind is like a mirror. It reflects what's around it. If you're showing the Dalai Lama images of the death and suffering in Ukraine, he is not laughing. He is probably crying. If he's with people that are his friends, people that he likes, he's laughing and having a good time. He is a mirror. Okay, they don't tend to take pictures of the Dalai Lama when he's crying, but I guarantee you he's crying. You cannot be as deeply connected to reality as he is and not feel the pain and not experience the suffering of others. Not his own, others. That's where he's different. He's not crying tears for himself. He's always crying tears for others. So yeah, could we engage all the time? Yeah, but who could do that, right? I mean, we're still human. So we engage when we engage, and there's other times we go for a walk in the woods, and there's other times we have a nice dinner with friends, and there's other times, we take a nap, whatever, we have to balance in our own lives.
I suspect the Dalai Lama, and I don't know him, but I suspect that he has also transcended a lot of the demons and tortures and sort of all the various sufferings that we go through. I suspect he's operating from a different baseline, probably one of joy or I don't know, joy, but I don't know, something akin to that. Yeah.
Well, again, when the Dalai Lama is asked about anger, he says that he experiences anger. But his anger is when he witnesses the suffering of others. He's not, you can't offend his ego and get him angry, but you can hurt his neighbor and he'll get angry. And then he'll express that anger remarkably appropriately unlike most of us, right? But he does. I think, what he has eliminated is the personal aspect, his personal suffering, his personal feelings of grief and loss, but not of, for the world. That's the whole thing to this awakening. There's two sides to this awakening thing. Whatever peace, whatever happiness, whatever it may bring us, it also brings us the suffering. To me, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the Dharma. I mean, I've said this before, I'll say again, we don't become sociopaths. We're not sitting there smiling while children are being bombed. And moreover, we are aware of our responsibility. I'm sure the Dalai Lama is aware of his responsibility. He has devoted his entire life to helping others. Entire life, because when he's practicing, he's not practicing to make himself a happier Dalai Lama. He's practicing for the benefit of the world. It's really a significant difference. Most of us, when we come to the cushions, we come because of some pain or suffering in our own lives. Nothing wrong with that. That's how most of us come to the Dharma. We're unhappy, we're uncomfortable, we're not getting our lives aren't as fulfilling as we'd like them to be. And so we say, okay, I'm going to try this meditation stuff. But hopefully at some point a shift occurs where it's no longer saying, I need to do this for me, and we're saying, I need to do this for the world. The Bodhisattva vow that we recite at the end of every sitting. The Dalai Lama is a Bodhisattva. And that's what he's manifesting for us.
I just finished a book which pointed out to me that the Dalai Lama has very, very stiff competition. And the book that I read was by Sarah Chase, who spent a number of an NPR reporter and spent a number of years in Afghanistan. And it was about corruption, mostly corruption in our country and how it evolved, and how the Gilded Age is now back upon us and what it took to get out of that. And so it was very overwhelming, like, what do we do about this? It is so huge. And her last chapter was, okay, I'm going to give you some thoughts about, what you can do about this. So I went to the last chapter, and basically what she was saying was just do something. But she talked about how, like, for example, use a local bank. Don't support these big banks who are financing fossil fuels or whatever. Use your local store instead of the big box that goes in. Local sorts of things. Look at your own local politics. But she made a really good point about how we can say, oh yes, I will do something, and then we get lulled back into the machine, I'll call it. yes, I don't want to order from Amazon. I want to use the local, but gee, they don't have this particular item, and I could go someplace else, but then I have to fill it out and do a whole password, and Amazon just boom sends it. And Sarah Chase was making the point that the system is set up, our society is set up to make us comfortable enough that it's really hard to sustain just do something. And when you mentioned sending our poor people to war, it reminded me of Vietnam. And when it was, when we were drafting everyone, including the young men, or all the men, all the young men out of college and from expensive or well-off families, what happened? Well, we all took to the streets. You can't do this. We're not going. But when that burden was lifted off a certain part of society, then it was left to, well, this is a good opportunity for you poor people. You can go over and see a different part of the world. And I agree with your precept, and I also recognize how difficult it is, because the game's rigged against doing something. And that's not an excuse, but it's a reality, and sustaining do something it's difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think that's why number one, we cannot really striving for perfection is not realistic. Striving for improvement, striving to do a little bit better, but you're right, it is stacked against. And, life is stacked against, I think one of the biggest reasons people don't do more in terms of social justice or environmental justice, so on, is because they're so consumed with living their lives. When you've gone to work all day and you come home and you're exhausted and the kids need dinner on the table and, on and on, where's the time to be involved in some kind of activism? It's just not falling further behind is a full-time occupation, right? Keeping jobs, keeping food on the table, keeping the mortgage paid, all of these things. And you're right. And there's all the traps. There's the debt trap. How many, offers do we get for new credit cards? And, you could be swimming in debt right up to your ears, fighting to make the bills every month. And the credit card offers come pouring in, right? And so that, in a sense, that is the system stacking it. People who are in debt can't worry about social justice. They've got to worry about making enough money to keep from getting thrown out on the streets or not having enough food for their kids. It's, so ironically, it takes a certain level of privilege to kind of protest, kind of step out of it. Like we said about Amazon, it is so easy and so convenient. I mean, for someone like I'm 20 miles from the nearest place I can shop in any significant way. So I've got to drive a 40-mile round trip. And now the cost of gas, it's ridiculous, or I can push the button and Amazon's going to make it materialize in 48 hours or whatever. What do I do? These are hard choices. And, how am I helping the world more? By burning the gas or by pushing the button? But I think it's the attention, I think it's awareness, the mindfulness, it's asking the question and trying not to. It's so easy, as you say, it's so easy to run on autopilot. And again, often a necessity, because we don't have the time, we don't have the energy. You know, when we get a little time, we want to collapse. We want to recreate a little, or, you know, which is extremely appropriate. And I don't know how you sustain it. I have friends who are on the bridges every single week protesting war. You know, I just passed a bunch the other day. We were driving through Bucksport, and on the bridge there was lined with people. And they're doing that all the time. You know, I can't sustain that. I don't know how they do it, frankly. But again, I think, you know, I think we get hung up, we collectively, on imagining that we need radical transformation, not simple transformation. The radical transformation may be impossible, but the simple transformation is almost always possible. You know, the single instances of how do I do better in this moment with this thing, you know, and then how do I do better in this moment with this thing? How do I do better in this moment with this thing? And if enough people are doing that, the transformation takes place. If we're setting an example for our families, friends, neighbors, we're doing it differently, you know. Simple things. People are turning their lawns into wildflower gardens. They're stopping all the chemicals. You know, they're stopping all the synthetic fertilizers. They're letting nature take back over. That's not even doing, that's not doing. Right? It's just allowing the natural processes to, you know, simple things like that. I'd like to believe that ultimately they will be important. You know, none of us can solve the world food crisis, but we can plant a garden. None of us can stop Monsanto, but we can stop supporting Monsanto. You know, we probably need to end up shortly. I don't even know what time it is, but you know, just kind of, and I would be untruthful if I didn't say there are times when I feel absolute despair. You know, Susan mentioned corruption. Everything at every level of our society is so corrupt today. Our elected officials, corrupt, almost 100%. They're being bought off by special interests. You know, yeah, God. And those of us in Maine who are witnessing this at Elliott Cutler thing, right? I mean, how much more corrupt can it be? You know, at every level of our society. And so it's easy to get discouraged. I get discouraged. I'd be very dishonest, you know, and then I've just got to pull myself back and say, what's the next thing that I can do? If I stay in that space of discouragement, I'm paralyzed and I'm done. And I am part of the problem instead of part of the solution. I've got to let go of whatever that is that's discouraging me and begin again. I don't know. You know, a few weeks ago, I talked about hope and optimism. You know, hope and optimism are not Buddhist concepts. Then Joan Halifax just went and talked about hope as as a Buddhist teacher. Which, okay, so Joan disagrees with me, so obviously she's not correct. But that said, I don't necessarily see hope and optimism. I see effort and action. Effort and action. Hope and optimism can arise out of that. But to just, no, I'm optimistic, the world's going to get better. How do I know that? What evidence have I got for that? Probably pretty scant. But I can say I can do something. I can do something every day. And if enough of us do something every day, it is going to change.
Really quickly, Peter, you brought up the Elliot Cutler thing. I was thinking about him a lot during today's talk. A friend of mine sent me his mugshot, and I was just filled with loathing, and I found myself in a conversation with my wife about what's going to happen to him in jail, and sort of feeling rewarded by that. And then, you know, it's trying to get to a place of some kind of, I don't know. Compassion for this man who is really loathsome. And I don't even think I could share that with my friends or with my wife, because I think they'd probably have not a great reaction to it. But so it's something I'm secretly working on. That is sort of timely for our precepts that we're talking about today.
No, do people who are not in Maine know what we're talking about? Some do, some have no idea. Okay, so Elliot Cutler is or maybe I should say it in the past tense, was a wealthy and influential businessman who ran for governor a couple of times, and in fact was the spoiler each time that allowed the extreme right-wing Paul LePage to get in, because kind of Cutler was kind of sort of middle of the roadish. So some liberals voted for him and some Republicans voted for him, but it was enough that it pulled the state to the right. Anyway, and he has just been arrested for child pornography. Children under 12, I guess, is the nature of his charge. Means that the children were very young. And, you know, and obviously, you know, he hasn't been convicted, but, you know, we know that there isn't a district attorney in the world who's going to go into the home of somebody that wealthy and powerful and seize stuff if they aren't pretty absolutely sure that they're going to make a strong case and convict. So it's pretty damning. But, you know, it's just, we've had so many instances in recent years of these wealthy and powerful men who believe that they are beyond the law, that they are beyond human decency. You know, that, and unfortunately, this is another example. But Robert, you're right. You know, we've got to find a way, as Buddhists, we've got to find a way to have some compassion for this man, not for what he did. My God, we don't do that. Look at what the poor Judge Jackson Brown went through this week on the possibility that she might be soft on pedophiles. but we don't have to be soft on pedophiles, but we've got to have compassion for this man. And if, you know, there, but for the grace of God, go us. You know, we all have the capacity to do awful things. And I think that frankly is the origin point for the compassion, is being able to say, okay, I am human. I can make egregious mistakes. Therefore, I can understand other human. I can't sympathize with it. I can't, you know, be tolerant of it, but I can kind of understand that another human being is also fallible.
Well, and if it helps, just on a purely psychological basis, most people who sexually abuse children were themselves sexually abused as children. Doesn't forgive them, but sometimes it helps you figure out why they're so fucked up.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, you know, to the extent that certainly can be another doorway for some compassion, to understand that it is a repetition compulsion of their own past trauma. I don't know whether that's at play here, but and it's interesting. I don't know if he'll spend a day in jail. You know, talk about how he'll, you know, has he reached that threshold of enough money and enough power that he will never see a day in jail? And we're seeing that, you know, that's another thing that's kind of making me nuts, the whole world nuts. There's no accountability. We had people attempt to overthrow the government of the United States who are walking around happy and free, you know, we've, you know, and I'm skeptical that any of them will ever see a day in jail. Seditious and treasonous acts, and will tolerate society. So, because those people, the ones who are going to jail, yeah, the poor schmucks who showed up on January 6th, but not the organizers, not the inciters, right? So this Cutler thing has interested me in that perspective too. Is like, is he ever going to be held accountable in a significant way, or is he going to get, you know, house arrest and 6 months probation or something really nominal in terms of the gravity of his crime? I'd bet the latter. I'd bet the latter. How do we get here? So we got to keep going. We got to keep trying. We got to keep doing. We got to work on ourselves, our compassion. Okay. Any last thoughts? Okay. Kind of a heavy note to end on, but maybe that's okay.
Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.